welcome back. So now we're going to actually start the process of talking to the back end. The way the back end communication works is through a service object. So the very first thing you have to do is you have to create a service object, and then we're going to create queries for like the insert, the list, the insert again to do the update, and then the delete. And those things are going to be executed with the service object. So let's just go ahead and go into our MovieQuotes table view controller. And you can add this code wherever you'd like. I'm going to choose to add it somewhere near the top. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this lazy loading strategy. So we're going to make a variable called service. It's going to be a GTL, that is going to be a GTL service MovieQuotes object. And what we're going to do is we're going to set it up with a computed property and then a stored property that kind of backs it up. We've seen this a couple times before, and I just like doing this. I like doing it because it's kind of how Objective-C worked, in that you always had like a getter and a setter, and then you had like an underlying instance variable that was backing it up. And what we'll do is we'll say if the service is not nil, then return it, right? And actually don't just return it because it's an optional, return it, exclamation point. And then if it's not prepared, then we're going to create it, right? And so like the very basic bones of this is we would just say GTL service MovieQuotes. So we're going to create the thing. Now we are going to do a little bit more setup in here, but this is the basic flow, right? So we're creating a service object, which is, an optional technically, and then we've got a getter for it, which is a required, and this whole flow just works out nicely. So what do we need to do to set up this guy? One thing we need to do is we need to tell it what backend it's looking at. Hopefully it picked that up without your help. So if you open up the MovieQuotes API and you click on the service, it should be pointing to your deployed backend by default. One thing I'm going to be doing is we're going to make it to where you can do local host testing as well. So we're going to actually do like some additional setup if is local host testing. So I suppose I ought to make that variable. So if we're doing local host testing, I'm going to do one thing, and then if I'm not doing local host testing, I'm going to do something slightly different. So bear with me. I know I'm kind of doing this in a weird order. So if it is local host testing, so we're just going to set this to be true or false. So if it's true, we'll do this like additional setup. And the setup that we want to do is we want to say on the service what the RPC URL is. And so if we're doing localhost, we want to point somewhere different than the deployed version. If you go look at the deployed version, you can see what they're like pointing to. I'm just going to copy it here. So this is in the service MovieQuotes.m file. If that's what it looked like for them, I'm going to go ahead and make a constant up here. So this is the localhost URL. Oh, I think I called it a localhost RPC URL in the notes. Not a big difference. And the one thing that changes is instead of being this .appspot.com, it's just going to be localhost and then the port number, which is 8080. And so I've made that constant, and then I've got to use it down here. So the RPC URL is equal to, and it actually needs to be an NS URL, which is created from a string from my localhost RPC URL. So by default, it's going to go to deployed, but if localhost testing, that flag is true, it's going to go to my localhost RPC. There's all kinds of little details. It's easiest if you just kind of type them and then you look at them later. There's a thing called the fetch service, allow localhost request true that you have to set as well. And that's necessary because localhost is going to be using HTTP, not HTTPS, so you have to set that flag. A little bit more setup we'd like to do. There's a thing called retry enabled, and personally, sure, why not? Go ahead and retry. If you fail once, try again before you give up. Sounds great. Those are the only things you have to set. There is also a thing on there called API version, I believe. And if you would like to set that, you can. We're using version 1, which is the default. I don't think you need to set that, but I saw it was on the object, and so I thought, hey, what the heck, I'll set it. So we create a new service, and then we do a little setup on it. And if we're doing local host testing, we change the RPC URL so that those commands go somewhere else. And so that's what this looks like. So now we've got our service ready. So that's the service, and that's what it looks like. Just because this video is fairly short and I need to do it at some point, I'm going to sneak on one more thing. I'm going to scroll down to like near the bottom, and I'm just going to make a little mark, and I'm just going to call it private helper methods. One thing that you deal with a lot is worrying about errors and potential errors that might go off. And so one thing that'd be nice is it'd be nice to have a little helper method to just show an error dialog. And so I'll just call it underscore just to show that it's a private thing, show error dialog. I always go back and forth about the whether I want to start it with an underscore or not. But I'm going to receive an error. Oops, been doing too much Objective-C programming. Receive an error. I'm going to return nothing. And all I'm going to do in here is I'm just going to make a little alert controller. So I'm just going to say UI alert controller. Should probably copy from some other code, but I'm going to have a title, a message, and then a preferred style. I'm just going to make my title say, endpoints error. And then my message will be whatever the localized description is on the error. And my preferred style is, of course, alert. Great, so that's my alert controller. I know that starts to get to be a lot for the screen. Let me see if I can make it a little cleaner. So I'm just going to make this little message. I need to have at least one action on here so that you can make it go away. So I'm just going to call it a UI alert action. And I'm going to use the one that has a title, and I'm just going to let them say OK. The style, I'll just say default, and then the handler, I actually don't need a handler. I just want the message to go away, so I'm just going to say nil. And then the alert controller, I'm going to say add action, my default action, and then I'm going to go ahead and present the navigation control, or present the view controller called alert controller, animated sure, and when it animates, do I need a completion handler? No, I do not. So this is just a little helper method because I'm going to have a lot of times where I'm going to have potentially an error, and I just want to show it in a little alert dialog. I suppose we could test it, but then we'd have to create an error to test it. My guess is that if you go through this video lecture, you'll probably see this dialog pop up at some point, and it's just a little helper method to make error handling a lot easier. All right, just snuck that one on. Hopefully you've got that. You can copy it from the notes as well. I find that sometimes just as easy instead of watching me do things. Next time, let's come back, and we're going to go ahead and use our service to do a read. See you then. Bye.